The Man Who Made Psychoanalysis Scream. Paris, 1953, a wood-paneled conference room in the Société Psychanalytique de Paris, the most prestigious psychoanalytic society in France. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Around a mahogany table sit the elders of French psychoanalysis, conservative, methodical men who have spent decades building careers on orthodox Freudian principles. And then there is Jacques Lacan. At 52 years old, Lacan sits at the head of the table, his trademark circular glasses reflecting the lamplight, his expression inscrutable. He has just delivered a lecture that has left his colleagues stunned, outraged, some openly hostile. He has suggested that everything they think they know about the unconscious is wrong, that their careful 50-minute sessions are arbitrary theater, that their understanding of the ego is backwards, that Freud himself, the sacred father of psychoanalysis, has been fundamentally misunderstood by his own disciples. The room erupts, accusations fly. Lacan is called arrogant, irresponsible, dangerous. One elder analyst stands and declares that Lacan is destroying psychoanalysis from within, that he must be expelled before he corrupts an entire generation of practitioners. Lacan lights another cigarette, takes a long drag, and smiles. "Gentlemen," he says in his elegant, infuriating French, "I am not destroying psychoanalysis. I am saving it from you." Within months, Lacan would be formally excommunicated from the International Psychoanalytical Association. He would be banned, shunned, treated as a heretic and a madman. His theories would be called incomprehensible, his clinical methods deemed unethical, his entire project dismissed as the ravings of a narcissist who cared more about being brilliant than being right. But Lacan didn't care, because he knew something his critics didn't. He was right. And over the next 3 decades, his radical reimagining of psychoanalysis would reshape philosophy, literature, film theory, cultural studies, and our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. This is the story of how one man fought the ghost of Freud, declared war on his own profession, and revealed truths about the human psyche so disturbing that we're still trying to process them today. This is the story of Jacques Lacan, the rebel who broke psychology and forced us to confront the terrifying reality of who we really are. Or rather, who we really aren't.
The Making of a Revolutionary. Jacques-Marie Émile Lacan was born on April 13, 1901, in Paris, into a comfortable bourgeois Catholic family. His father was a successful vinegar and mustard merchant, a respectable, practical businessman who expected his son to follow a similarly conventional path. Young Jacques had other ideas. From childhood, Lacan was brilliant, difficult, and fascinated by the mysteries of the human mind. He excelled in school but showed little interest in following rules or respecting authority. He read voraciously philosophy, literature, poetry, everything he could find about the emerging science of psychology. While other boys his age were playing sports or learning their father's trades, Lacan was devouring texts by Spinoza, Hegel, and the shocking new works of Sigmund Freud. Freud's ideas were explosive in early 20th century Europe. The suggestion that humans were driven by unconscious sexual desires, that childhood experiences shaped adult neuroses, that dreams had meanings buried beneath their surface content, all this was scandalous, revolutionary, and absolutely mesmerizing to the young Lacan. He enrolled in medical school with the specific intention of becoming a psychiatrist. But psychiatry in the 1920s was a grim business. Asylums filled with patients deemed incurable, treatments that ranged from useless to barbaric, a fundamental assumption that mental illness was a biological pathology requiring physical intervention. Lacan found this approach deadening. He believed that madness, neurosis, psychosis, all the manifestations of psychological suffering were meaningful. They weren't just broken biology. They were attempts to communicate something, to express truths that couldn't be spoken in ordinary language. In 1932, Lacan completed his medical dissertation on paranoid psychosis, focusing on a woman he called Amy, who had attempted to murder a famous actress. What interested Lacan wasn't just diagnosing Amy's condition, but understanding the structure of her delusion, the logic of her paranoia, the way her psychosis was an attempt to solve an unbearable internal conflict. The dissertation caught the attention of the Parisian intellectual elite. Here was a psychiatrist who wrote like a philosopher, who treated his patients' words as texts to be interpreted rather than symptoms to be eliminated. Lacan quickly became part of the vibrant surrealist movement, befriending artists like Salvatore Dali and writers like André Breton. He attended salons, gave lectures, cultivated a reputation as an intellectual provocateur. But his real education came when he began training as a psychoanalyst. Freud had died in 1939, but his theories dominated European intellectual life. Psychoanalysis was the revolutionary new science of the mind, promising to unlock the unconscious and free humanity from neurotic suffering. Or so the theory went. What Lacan discovered when he began practicing psychoanalysis was something disturbing. Freud's followers had already betrayed Freud's most radical insights. They had turned psychoanalysis into a conservative, ego-strengthening therapy aimed at adjusting patients to social norms. They had stripped away everything dangerous and transformative, leaving behind a technique for producing compliant, well-adapted citizens. This enraged Lacan. Freud hadn't discovered the unconscious just to help people feel better. He'd revealed something fundamental and terrifying about human existence, that we don't know ourselves, that we're split between conscious intentions and unconscious desires, that the self we think we inhabit is largely a fiction. Lacan decided he would restore Freud's radicalism. He would take psychoanalysis back to its shocking origins. He would force analysts to confront what Freud had actually discovered, not the sanitized version they preferred to teach. And in doing so, he would make enemies of everyone.
The Lie in the Mirror. The first bombshell came in 1936 at the 14th International Psychoanalytical Congress in Marienbad. Lacan, still a relatively junior analyst, delivered a paper titled The Mirror Stage as Formative of the I Function. It was only 10 minutes long. Lacan's presentation was cut short by the session chair, Ernest Jones, who was already annoyed by Lacan's theatrical style and dense, poetic language. But those 10 minutes would eventually become one of the most influential concepts in 20th century thought. Lacan described a deceptively simple scenario. An infant, somewhere between 6 and 18 months old, sees itself in a mirror for the first time. Before this moment, the infant experiences its body as fragmented. Hands that move, sensations that come and go, needs that arise without clear connection to a unified self. The infant doesn't have an I. It exists in a state of undifferentiated confusion. But then comes the mirror, and in the mirror, the infant sees something astonishing, a unified image, a complete, bounded, coherent body. Not the fragmentary chaos of internal experience, but a whole, recognizable form. The infant is captivated. It reaches toward the image, giggles, moves to make the image move. And in that moment of recognition, that's me, something fundamental occurs. The infant identifies with the mirror image. It takes that external visual representation as its identity. This seems natural. Obvious even. Of course we recognize ourselves in mirrors. What's the big deal? The big deal, Lacan argued, is that this founding moment of self-recognition is actually a moment of misrecognition. The mirror shows the infant a unified, coordinated, masterful body, but that's not what the infant actually experiences from the inside. Internally, the infant is still fragmented, still uncoordinated, still overwhelmed by needs and sensations it can't control. The mirror image is a lie, an ideal, a fantasy of completeness that doesn't match internal reality.
And yet the infant identifies with this lie. It says, "That's me," to an image that is fundamentally alienating, outside itself, idealized, not actually the truth of its embodied experience. This is the origin of the ego, Lacan argued. Not a natural development of self-awareness, but a founding moment of alienation. We come to know ourselves through an external image. We become who we are by identifying with something we're not. The implications were staggering. If the ego is founded on misrecognition, then the I we think we inhabit is already false from the beginning. We spend all our lives identified with an idealized self-image that doesn't match our actual fragmented, conflicted inner experience. This was a direct assault on ego psychology, which was becoming dominant in American psychoanalysis. Ego psychology argued that the goal of analysis was to strengthen the patient's ego, to help them develop better reality testing, more adaptive defenses, a more coherent sense of self. But Lacan said the ego itself was the problem. It wasn't the solution to psychological suffering, it was the source. The ego was a defensive structure, an imaginary identification that covered over the truth of our fundamental division and lack. This didn't go over well with his colleagues. Strengthening the ego was the whole point of their therapeutic work. Lacan was suggesting they were reinforcing exactly the structure that caused neurosis in the first place. But Lacan pushed further. He distinguished between the imaginary order, the realm of images, identifications, and egos, and what he would later call the symbolic order, the realm of language, law, and social structure. The mirror stage occurs in the imaginary. It's all about visual identification, about taking on an image. But humans don't stay in the imaginary. We enter language. We become speaking subjects. And when we enter language, everything changes again.
The three worlds you live in and don't know it. Over the next decade, Lacan developed what would become his most famous framework, the three orders or registers of human experience. He called them the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. These aren't just abstract philosophical categories. According to Lacan, these three orders structure every aspect of our psychological lives. We exist simultaneously in all three, and the tensions between them create everything we call subjectivity, desire, anxiety, and meaning. The imaginary order is the realm of images, identifications, and the ego. It's the world of mirrors, of seeing ourselves from the outside, of constructing an identity based on visual representations. The imaginary is fundamentally about duality, me and my image, self and other, subject and object. It's characterized by fascination, captivation, and aggression. Why aggression? Because the imaginary is structured by rivalry. The other person has what I want, completeness, recognition, the position I desire. In the imaginary, relationships are always competitive. The other is either a rival for my identity or a mirror in which I see myself. This is why small children fight so intensely. They're still primarily in the imaginary, relating to each other as rivals for the same position. That's my toy. I want what she has. The imaginary doesn't recognize that two people can occupy different positions simultaneously. There's only one position, the ideal position, and we all want it. But humans don't remain in the imaginary. Around age 2 or 3, something else intervenes: language. The symbolic order is the realm of language, law, and social structure. When we learn to speak, we enter a pre-existing system of meanings. We don't create language, we submit to it. We have to use the words that already exist, follow grammar rules we didn't invent, accept the categories and distinctions our culture provides. Lacan argued that entering the symbolic is both liberation and loss. Language gives us the ability to represent our experience, to communicate, to think in complex ways, but it also fundamentally alienates us from direct experience. Once we name something, we're no longer in immediate contact with it. The word mother isn't the same as the actual lived experience of the maternal presence. Language creates distance. Moreover, the symbolic order is impersonal. It operates according to laws and structures that existed before we were born and will continue after we die. We don't control language. It controls us. Our desires, thoughts, and identities are shaped by symbolic structures we didn't choose. Lacan famously declared, "The unconscious is structured like a language." This was his most radical revision of Freud. The unconscious isn't a seething cauldron of animal instincts, it's linguistic. It operates through metaphor, metonymy, puns, slips of the tongue, all the ways language produces meanings beyond conscious intention. This is why free association works in psychoanalysis. When patients speak without censoring, linguistic connections reveal unconscious meanings. A slip of the tongue isn't random, it's the unconscious speaking through the gaps in conscious discourse. But language can't capture everything. And this brings us to the third order, the most difficult and disturbing of Lacan's concepts. The real is what lies outside symbolization. It's not reality in the ordinary sense. That's already mediated by the imaginary and symbolic. The real is what resists representation entirely. It's the traumatic encounter with something that can't be integrated into our symbolic universe. Lacan often described the real as the impossible. It's what our symbolic structures are built to avoid, what we can't think or speak because it would shatter our entire framework of meaning. Think of it this way. The imaginary is the realm of meaning through images and identification. The symbolic is the realm of meaning through language and law. The real is where meaning fails entirely. It's the void at the center of our symbolic universe, the thing we're always circling around but can never directly confront. These three orders are always interacting, always in tension. A symptom, for example, might be a real traumatic kernel that can't be symbolized, which manifests in imaginary suffering, bodily pain, anxiety, and distorts symbolic functioning, inability to work, communicate, relate to others. The goal of Lacanian analysis isn't to strengthen the ego or adapt to reality. It's to traverse the fantasy structures that protect us from the real, to reach the traumatic core of our being, and to reconstruct our relationship to the impossible void at the center of subjectivity. This is not comforting therapy. This is an expedition into the abyss.
The father's no, entering the matrix of language. If the mirror stage introduces the infant to imaginary identification, there's another crucial moment in Lacanian development: entry into the symbolic order. And this entry is mediated by what Lacan called the name of the father, nom du père. This concept is complicated and has generated enormous controversy, so let's unpack it carefully. In the early months of life, the infant exists in a dyadic relationship with the mother, or primary caregiver. The mother is everything: source of nourishment, comfort, the entire world. The infant wants to be everything to the mother, to completely satisfy her, to merge with her in perfect union. This is what Lacan called the imaginary mother-child dyad. It's characterized by the fantasy of completeness, of total mutual satisfaction. The infant fantasizes that it is the phallus, the object of the mother's desire, the thing that completes her. But this fantasy can't last, because the mother desires something beyond the child. She speaks to other people. She leaves the room. She has interests, desires, and a life that doesn't revolve entirely around the infant. Most importantly, she refers to a third term, the father, or more abstractly, the symbolic law. When the mother says, "Wait, I have to talk to your father," or "because I said so," or invokes any rule or authority beyond the mother-child dyad, she introduces the symbolic order. She signals that there's a law, a structure, an authority that even she is subject to. This is what Lacan called the name of the father. It's not necessarily the actual biological father. It's the symbolic function that breaks up the imaginary mother-child fusion and introduces the child to language, law, and social structure. The name of the father says no to the child's fantasy of being everything to the mother. It castrates the child symbolically, separating them from the maternal body and inserting them into the symbolic order where they must use language, follow rules, and accept that they're not complete. This no is the founding prohibition. It's the incest taboo, yes, but more broadly, it's the law that separates, that creates distances, that forces the child to give up the fantasy of imaginary wholeness. And this no is traumatic. It's a wound, a loss that can never be recovered. The child loses the fantasy of merger with the mother, loses the illusion of completeness, and is thrown into the symbolic order where they must represent themselves through language, which always fails to fully capture experience. Lacan called this loss castration, not literal castration, but symbolic castration. The child is separated from the imaginary phallus, the fantasy of being the complete object of the mother's desire, and enters the symbolic order where the phallus becomes a signifier of lack. This is why Lacan said the phallus is a signifier. It doesn't refer to an actual penis. It refers to what's lost when we enter language. It signifies the gap between what we desire and what we can obtain, between what we are and what we want to be, between the real of our being and the symbolic representations available to us. Different people respond to this castration in different ways, and this is what creates the three major psychological structures Lacan identified: neurosis, psychosis, and perversion. Neurotics accept symbolic castration, but spend their lives trying to compensate for the loss. They submit to the name of the father, enter language, and follow social rules, but they're haunted by lack, by the sense that something's missing, by desires they can never quite fulfill. Psychotics foreclose the name of the father. They refuse symbolic castration, don't fully enter the symbolic order, and remain partially in the imaginary or exposed to invasions of the real. This is why psychotic experience often involves hearing voices, the symbolic invading from outside rather than being internalized, delusions, attempts to construct a personal symbolic system, and paranoia, the sense that others are stealing the phallus. This framework transformed how psychoanalysts understood mental illness. Instead of seeing neurosis and psychosis as medical diseases requiring treatment, Lacan saw them as different structural relationships to language, law, and lack. But Lacan's emphasis on the name of the father also generated criticism. Feminists argued that his phallocentrism reinforced patriarchal power structures, that making the father's no central to psychological development naturalized male authority. Lacan's defenders pointed out that the name of the father is a symbolic function, not a defense of actual patriarchy. It's the function of separation and law, which could in principle be exercised by any figure. But the criticism stuck, and Lacan's later work became more cautious about this concept. What's undeniable is the power of Lacan's central insight. We become speaking subjects only by accepting a fundamental loss. Language gives us the ability to represent the world, but at the cost of immediate connection to it. We gain symbolic mastery, but lose imaginary wholeness. And we spend the rest of our lives dealing with this founding trauma of separation. This is why therapy can never truly cure neurosis, because the neurotic's suffering isn't a disease to be eliminated. It's the structure of subjectivity itself, the inevitable consequence of being a speaking being caught between imaginary identifications, symbolic demands, and the real of jouissance.
Why you can never truly get what you want. One of Lacan's most disturbing insights concerns the nature of desire itself. His formula is deceptively simple, but has profound implications. Desire is always desire of the other. What does this mean? It means we never desire objects directly. We desire what the other desires. We desire to be desired by the other. Our desires are always mediated through the symbolic order, through our fantasy about what would complete us, what would make us whole. Think about your own desires for a moment. Why do you want what you want? Is it really about the object itself, or is it about what obtaining that object would mean, the recognition it would bring, the identity it would confirm, the proof it would provide that you're valuable, complete, worthy? Someone desires an expensive car. Is it really about the mechanical properties of the vehicle? No. It's about what the car signifies: success, status, desirability. It's about imagining themselves as the kind of person who drives such a car and imagining others recognizing them as such. Someone desires a romantic partner. Is it really about that specific person's qualities? Partly, yes, but it's also about what being chosen by that person would mean. It's about being seen as desirable, about filling a lack, about achieving completeness through union with another. Lacan distinguished between need, demand, and desire. Need is biological: hunger, thirst, warmth. Needs can be satisfied. You eat, you're no longer hungry. Need met. But humans aren't just biological creatures. We're speaking beings who must articulate our needs through language. When the infant cries, it's not just expressing hunger. It's making a demand for the other's presence, for love, for recognition. Come to me, acknowledge me, show me I matter. Demand is always a demand for love. And demand can never be fully satisfied because what we're really asking for, unconditional love, total recognition, proof that we're the exclusive object of the other's desire, is impossible. Desire is what remains when need is subtracted from demand. It's the leftover, the residue, the gap between what can be articulated and what's really wanted. Desire is always desire for something beyond the object. It's desire for desire itself, desire to keep desiring, desire for a lack that can never be filled. This is why Lacan said desire is the desire of the other, in a double sense. One, we desire what the other desires, taking our cues from others about what's valuable. And two, we desire to be desired by the other, to be the object of their lack.
Consider the structure of romantic desire. You're attracted to someone. Why? Because they seem to possess some quality that would complete you, that would fill your lack. But when you actually get together, something strange happens. Either you become dissatisfied, they didn't actually complete you, or, even stranger, they become less desirable precisely because they're now available. Lacan called this the paradox of desire. We desire most intensely what we don't have. The moment desire is satisfied, it evaporates. This is why desire is fundamentally about lack, not satisfaction. We don't actually want our desires fulfilled, we want to keep desiring. This creates a tragic structure. We pursue objects thinking they'll satisfy us, but satisfaction would actually be the death of desire. So we're caught in an impossible bind. We must keep pursuing what we don't want to actually obtain. Lacan formalized his concept of objet petit a. This is the object cause of desire, the thing we fantasize would complete us if only we could possess it. But objet A doesn't actually exist as a positive entity. It's a stand-in for the lack itself, a way of representing the void at the center of our being. Different people fix on different objects as their objet A: romantic partners, career success, wealth, beauty, knowledge, experiences. But all these specific objects are ultimately substitutes for something that can't be named. The lost completeness we fantasized about in the imaginary mother-child dyad before symbolic castration separated us from our being. We spend our lives chasing object after object, thinking if only I had that, then I'd be complete, then I'd be satisfied. But each time we get the object, the lack reappears. We were chasing a mirage. The real object of desire is desire itself, the endless movement toward a satisfaction that must remain just out of reach. This is why consumer capitalism is so effective. It operates on the logic of desire. Advertisements don't really sell products. They sell the fantasy that possessing this product will fill your lack, will make you complete. Of course it won't, but that failure just generates more desire for the next product. Lacan's point isn't that we should stop desiring. That's impossible. We're constituted by desire. The point is to recognize the structure, to traverse the fantasy that some object will finally complete us, and to accept the fundamental lack that defines human existence. This is the endpoint of Lacanian analysis. Not satisfaction, not cure, not happiness, but subjective destitution. The moment the analysant recognizes that there's no answer to the question, what do I want? Because desire is groundless, circular, and endless movement around an empty center. This is not nihilism, though it can sound like it. Lacan argued that recognizing the groundlessness of desire is actually liberating. Once you stop believing that some object will complete you, you're free to engage with life without the tyranny of fantasized wholeness. But getting to this point requires confronting the most disturbing aspect of desire, jouissance.
The prison of words, how language traps your desires. Language is both our greatest tool and our most fundamental trap. It allows us to think, communicate, and represent our experience, but it also fundamentally alienates us from what we're trying to express. Lacan argued that the unconscious is structured like a language, operating through mechanisms like metaphor and metonymy. But what does this actually mean in practice? Let's start with metaphor. In rhetoric, metaphor is substituting one term for another. Life is a journey, time is money. But Lacan saw metaphor as a fundamental mechanism of the unconscious. Symptoms are metaphors. When someone has a psychosomatic paralysis of their hand, that hand is substituting for something else, perhaps guilt about masturbation, or an impulse to strike someone, or a memory of touching something forbidden. The symptom says through the body what can't be said in words. The hand becomes a metaphor for whatever traumatic content the unconscious can't symbolize directly. Metonymy is displacement, associating one thing with another through contiguity. The White House said uses the building to represent the administration. But unconsciously, metonymy is how desire moves from object to object, never settling, always displacing. You desire a car, but really you desire the status it represents. But really you desire the recognition status brings. But really you desire to fill the void of your lack. Each object metonymically stands in for the next, creating an endless chain where desire slides from signifier to signifier without ever reaching final satisfaction. Language creates this slippage. Words don't have fixed meanings. They mean through their differences from other words. Cat means what it means because it's not bat or cap or dog. Meaning is differential, relational, never grounded in a final referent. Lacan formalized this with his famous statement, "There is no other of the other," meaning there's no final guarantor of meaning, no ultimate reference point that grounds the symbolic order. Language is a closed system of signifiers referring only to other signifiers. There's no escape to pure meaning outside the system. This creates what Lacan called the sliding of the signified under the signifier. The things we're trying to talk about, signifieds, keep slipping away from the words we use, signifiers. We can never quite say what we mean. There's always a gap between intention and expression, between what we feel and what we can articulate. This is why analysis works through speech. When patients free associate, speaking without censoring, the connections between signifiers reveal unconscious meanings. A patient might be talking about their father, and suddenly father connects to further, in French, père and port, revealing that father represents distance, always being further away, unreachable.
These linguistic connections aren't conscious. They emerge from the way signifiers are linked in the patient's unconscious. The analyst listens for these slippages, these moments when language reveals more than the patient intended. But language doesn't just reveal the unconscious, it creates it. Lacan argued that the unconscious is formed when we enter language. Repression happens when certain signifiers become unbearable and must be pushed out of conscious discourse. But they don't disappear. They remain in the unconscious, where they continue to structure our experience from beneath. This is why symptoms have meanings. A phobia isn't just irrational fear, it's a signifier that has become loaded with unconscious content. The spider, the height, the enclosed space represents something that can't be consciously acknowledged. In treatment, the analyst's job is to help the patient reconstruct their relationship to these signifiers, to symbolize what was previously unsymbolizable, to speak what couldn't be spoken. But there's a limit. Some experiences resist symbolization entirely. They're too traumatic, too overwhelming, too close to the real. And when language fails, when we encounter something that can't be put into words, we're touching the limit of the symbolic order. Lacan called these points of failure jouissance, a French term that combines pleasure, enjoyment, and orgasm, but in Lacan's usage means something darker, a pleasure so intense it's painful, an enjoyment beyond the pleasure principle. Jouissance is what lies beyond language, what the symbolic order is structured to avoid. It's related to Freud's death drive, the compulsion to repeat traumatic experiences, the tendency to seek out suffering, the way we sometimes seem determined to destroy ourselves. Why would we seek pain? Because jouissance is addictive. It's the real breaking through the symbolic, the moment when meaning collapses and we're confronted with pure intensity. It's terrifying but also compelling, pulling us toward experiences that shatter our defenses. Drug addiction is an obvious example. The high is jouissance, an intensity that obliterates symbolic meaning, that reduces you to pure sensation. But it's destructive, unsustainable, ultimately deadly. Yet addicts can't stop chasing it. But jouissance appears in less obvious places too. The neurotic who keeps entering destructive relationships, repeating the same patterns, suffering in familiar ways. They're not just victims of bad luck. They're unconsciously seeking a particular form of jouissance, a familiar suffering that provides a perverse satisfaction. Or consider self-harm. Why would someone cut themselves? The pain is jouissance. It provides a sense of reality, of being real in a way that symbolic existence doesn't. When everything feels numb and meaningless, physical pain can feel like truth. Lacan's later work became increasingly focused on jouissance and its relationship to the real. He developed complex topological models, Mobius strips, Borromean knots, trying to map the impossible relationships between the imaginary, symbolic, and real. These models are notoriously difficult to understand. Lacan seemed to be deliberately pushing language to its limit, using mathematical structures and neologisms to point toward what can't be directly said. Critics accused him of obscurantism, of hiding behind jargon to disguise the emptiness of his ideas. But defenders argued that Lacan's dense, elusive style was necessary. He was trying to communicate about the limits of communication, to use language to point beyond language. The truth is probably both. Lacan was genuinely exploring concepts at the edge of articulability, but he also enjoyed mystification, appreciated his own brilliance, and cultivated an aura of genius that served his considerable ego. Which brings us to a crucial point. Understanding Lacan requires understanding the man himself. His theories weren't just abstract intellectual constructions. They were inseparable from his personality, his practice, and his increasingly messianic vision of himself as psychoanalysis's true inheritor.
The scandal of variable length sessions. By the mid-1950s, Lacan had become the most controversial figure in French psychoanalysis. His theoretical innovations were one thing, but his clinical practice was causing genuine outrage. Standard psychoanalytic technique inherited from Freud prescribed 50-minute sessions at fixed times, multiple sessions per week, with the analyst maintaining neutral silence except for occasional interpretations. This structure was considered essential to the analytic process. Lacan threw it all out. He began conducting sessions of variable length, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 50, sometimes several hours. He'd interrupt patients mid-sentence and end the session,
Or he'd extend sessions indefinitely, blurring the boundaries between analysis and life. His rationale was theoretical. He argued that the fixed 50-minute session was arbitrary, that it prioritized the analyst's schedule over the patient's unconscious. The unconscious doesn't operate on clock time. It has its own rhythm, its own timing. A significant interpretation might emerge after 5 minutes. Why continue for 45 more minutes just because convention demands it? Moreover, Lacan argued that variability introduced productive uncertainty. When patients didn't know how long the session would last, they couldn't use time defensively. They couldn't save important material for the end or fill time with chatter. They had to engage immediately, authentically. The interruption itself could be an intervention. Cutting someone off mid-sentence highlighted a particular signifier, made it stand out, forced the patient to think about why that particular moment was significant. But critics saw this as pure manipulation. Variable sessions meant Lacan could see more patients, charge more fees, and exercise arbitrary power over people in vulnerable positions. They accused him of narcissism, of putting his own convenience and ego before patients' welfare. The International Psychoanalytical Association demanded he return to standard technique. Lacan refused. In 1953, he split from the Société psychoanalytique de Paris and formed the Société française de psychanalyse with several colleagues who shared his theoretical orientation. But the conflict continued. The IPA refused to recognize the new society unless Lacan changed his methods. For a decade, negotiations dragged on. Lacan's supporters argued for theoretical pluralism. The IPA insisted on technical orthodoxy. Finally, in 1963, the IPA issued an ultimatum: remove Lacan from the training analyst list or be permanently excluded. The Société Française de Psychanalyse, desperate for legitimacy, agreed to sacrifice Lacan. He was excommunicated, banned from training new analysts, officially ejected from the worldwide psychoanalytic community. Lacan was devastated, enraged, and energized. He immediately formed yet another institution, the École Freudienne de Paris. This would be his school, operating according to his principles, free from IPA control. And something unexpected happened. Instead of ending his career, excommunication made Lacan more famous. He became a cause célèbre among Parisian intellectuals. His seminars, which he'd been giving publicly since 1953, became legendary events. Every Wednesday, hundreds of people packed into the amphitheater at the Sainte-Anne Hospital, and later the École Normale Supérieure, to hear Lacan hold forth for hours. Analysts, philosophers, writers, artists, students, curious onlookers, everyone wanted to witness the notorious Lacan in person. These weren't lectures in the ordinary sense, they were performances. Lacan would arrive late, dressed impeccably, often with a silk scarf and his trademark round glasses. He'd chain smoke throughout, speaking in dense, elusive, often incomprehensible prose. He'd make puns, quote poets, reference mathematics and linguistics, suddenly switch topics without explanation. People left confused, mesmerized, arguing about what he'd meant. Some thought he was a charlatan, others were convinced they'd witnessed genius. Everyone had an opinion. Lacan cultivated this ambiguity deliberately. He wanted to disrupt comfortable understanding, to force his audience to think rather than passively receive. If his meaning was immediately clear, he'd failed. The difficulty was the point. But there was also genuine substance. Through these seminars, Lacan developed his mature theoretical system. He worked through Freud's texts line by line, offering radical reinterpretations. He engaged with contemporary structuralism, incorporating insights from linguistics, Saussure and Jakobson, anthropology, Levi-Strauss, and philosophy, Hegel and Heidegger. He introduced concept after concept, the graph of desire, formulas of sexuation, the discourse of the analyst versus the discourse of the master. Each seminar year had a theme: the ego, ethics, transference, anxiety, the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. And through it all, Lacan insisted he was doing nothing but reading Freud correctly. Everyone else had misunderstood. He alone grasped what Freud had truly discovered. This claim was both sincere and strategic. Sincere because Lacan genuinely believed Freud had made discoveries that his followers had buried. Strategic because positioning himself as Freud's true inheritor gave him authority against critics who accused him of deviation. But was Lacan really just reading Freud, or was he creating something new under the guise of interpretation? The answer is both. Lacan brought concepts to Freud that Freud himself never articulated: structuralist linguistics, mathematical topology, Hegelian philosophy. He read Freud through these lenses and found meanings Freud couldn't have intended. Yet Lacan also identified real tensions and ambiguities in Freud's texts that orthodox analysis had papered over. His insistence on returning to Freud's radicalism rather than accepting sanitized versions was legitimate. Love him or hate him, Lacan forced psychoanalysis to confront its own contradictions. And in doing so, he transformed it from a clinical technique into a comprehensive theory of human subjectivity.
The four discourses, the social games everyone is playing. In his 1969 to 1970 seminar, Lacan introduced one of his most brilliant and versatile concepts, the four discourses. This was his theory of social bonds, of the different ways subjects relate to each other through speech. A discourse, for Lacan, isn't just what you say. It's a structure that organizes social relationships, determining positions and roles. Every time we speak, we're occupying a position within one of these discourses, whether we realize it or not. The four discourses are mathematical permutations of four terms: the master signifier, S1, knowledge, S2, the divided subject, S, and surplus jouissance, A. The different positions these terms occupy create four distinct social configurations. The discourse of the master is the foundational discourse, the structure of traditional authority. The master issues commands, S1, that the slave executes through knowledge, S2, producing surplus, A, that the master enjoys while the slave's subjectivity, S, is repressed. This is the discourse of kings, bosses, teachers who claim to know. Do as I say because I'm the authority. The master doesn't actually know how things work. The slave has that knowledge, but the master's position gives them the right to command. Think of a CEO who doesn't understand the technical details but makes strategic decisions, or a teacher who claims expertise by position rather than demonstration. The master's authority comes from occupying the master's position, not from actual knowledge. The discourse of the university inverts this. Here, knowledge occupies the commanding position. This is the discourse of bureaucracy, technocracy, expertise. Do as I say because science, data, research proves it. University discourse claims to be neutral, objective, based on knowledge rather than arbitrary authority. But it's still a power structure. Experts tell non-experts how to live based on supposed knowledge. And the subject's desire is still repressed, this time in the name of objective truth. Modern institutions operate through university discourse. Medical authorities tell you how to be healthy. Economic experts tell you what policies to support. The authority comes from knowledge, but the effect is still subjection. The discourse of the hysteric challenges authority by questioning it. The hysteric speaks from their suffering, S, addressing the master with the question, "What do you want from me? What am I to you?" This discourse exposes the master's lack of real knowledge, revealing that authority is arbitrary. The hysteric doesn't want answers. They want to keep questioning, to maintain the position of not knowing, to prevent any final resolution that would end their interrogation. This is the discourse of protest, of critical theory, of anyone who refuses to accept existing power structures. It's also the discourse that drives analysis. The patient suffering questions the analyst's supposed knowledge, potentially generating new insights. The discourse of the analyst is Lacan's prescription for psychoanalytic practice. Here, the analyst occupies the position of object A, the cause of desire, the enigmatic other who knows nothing, but whose presence provokes the analysid to speak. The analyst doesn't give answers or explanations. They simply listen, occasionally punctuating with minimal interventions, creating a space where the analysid's divided subjectivity produces signifiers that reveal their unconscious knowledge. Analyst discourse is the only discourse that doesn't aim at mastery or knowledge accumulation. It aims at traversing fantasy, at reaching the point where the analysid confronts their fundamental lack and stops demanding that the other provide an answer. This is subjective destitution, the end point of analysis where the subject recognizes they're groundless, that their supposed identity is a fantasy, and that the other who might answer their questions doesn't exist. It sounds bleak, but Lacan argued it's actually liberating. Once you stop waiting for the other to tell you who you are or what you should desire, you're free to engage with life without the tyranny of imaginary wholeness or symbolic guarantee. You accept your division, your lack, your fundamental impossibility. And from that acceptance, genuine desire becomes possible. Not desire for fantasized completion, but desire as an ethical relation to the real.
The woman does not exist. Perhaps no aspect of Lacan's work has generated more controversy than his formulas of sexuation and his infamous statement, "The woman does not exist." In his 1970 seminars, particularly Seminar XX on feminine sexuality, Lacan presented a complex theory of sexual difference structured around different relationships to the phallic function and jouissance. For Lacan, sexual difference isn't biological or anatomical. It's about different positions in the symbolic order, different relationships to castration and lack. The masculine position is characterized by being all within the phallic function. Men are entirely subject to symbolic castration, entirely within language, entirely structured by the phallic signifier that marks lack. But there's an exception. The fantasy of a father who is not castrated, who possesses complete jouissance, who isn't subject to lack. This is the primal father of Freud's Totem and Taboo, the mythical figure who had all the women, enjoyed without limit, wasn't subject to any law. Of course, this father doesn't exist. He's a fantasy, a logical necessity of the masculine structure. Men are all castrated only because they fantasize an exception. The feminine position is different. Women are not all in the phallic function. They're partially within symbolic castration, but not entirely. There's something about feminine jouissance that exceeds the phallic, that isn't captured by the signifier, that remains other. This is why Lacan says the woman does not exist. If woman existed as a universal category, she'd be entirely within the symbolic, entirely defined by the phallic signifier. But feminine jouissance escapes this universal. Each woman is unique, not subsumable under a universal category. This not all gives women access to a supplementary jouissance beyond the phallic. Lacan calls it other jouissance, the jouissance of the body, mystical ecstasy, something that can't be articulated in phallic language. He cites the writings of mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila, whose descriptions of religious ecstasy read like accounts of a jouissance beyond language, beyond the phallic, touching something real that can't be symbolized. None of this means women are inherently mystical or that Lacan is biologizing sexual difference. These are positions in discourse, structural relationships to the symbolic order. Anyone can occupy either position regardless of anatomy. But this brings us to the core controversy. Is Lacan's entire framework phallocentric? Does making the phallus the fundamental signifier of lack inevitably privilege masculinity? Feminist responses to Lacan have been divided. Some, like Juliet Mitchell and Jacqueline Rose, argued that Lacan provides tools for understanding how patriarchy operates symbolically, how sexual difference is constructed through language. Recognizing that the woman does not exist reveals the falsity of patriarchal definitions of femininity. Others, like Luce Irigaray, argue that Lacan's framework is irredeemably phallocentric. By making the phallus central, by defining femininity as not all, i.e. negative relation to the masculine norm, Lacan reinforces rather than critiques patriarchy. Irigaray accused Lacan of describing feminine sexuality from an entirely masculine perspective, unable to articulate feminine jouissance except as other, as mystical, as beyond language. This, she argued, is the same old patriarchal move. Women as mystery, as incomprehensible, as defined by their difference from masculine norms. The debate continues. Some contemporary Lacanians have tried to develop more egalitarian versions of sexuation theory. Others argue that Lacan's late work moved beyond phallocentrism towards a more fluid understanding of jouissance. What's clear is that Lacan's formulations reflect the patriarchal symbolic order he was analyzing. Whether he was merely describing that order or reinforcing it remains disputed. Personally, I think there's truth in both positions. Lacan identified real structures of how patriarchy operates symbolically, but his framework also has blind spots, particularly around feminine subjectivity and non-binary possibilities. The value of Lacan isn't that he's correct about everything. It's that his concepts provide tools for thinking about subjectivity, desire, and symbolic structures in ways that continue to generate insights and debates decades later.
Why men and women can't understand each other, according to Lacan. When Jacques Lacan announced to his Parisian audience in the 1970s that there is no sexual relationship, the room must have erupted in confusion. Here was a man talking about psychoanalysis, the discipline founded on sexual drives and desires, declaring that sexual relationships fundamentally don't exist. What could he possibly mean? This wasn't clickbait from a provocateur trying to shock bourgeois sensibilities. It was the culmination of decades of clinical work and theoretical refinement. Lacan was making a profound claim about the impossibility of two human beings ever truly meeting as complete, complementary beings. The sexual relationship, as he understood it, doesn't exist because there is no universal formula that brings man, together with woman, in perfect harmony. To understand this controversial claim, we need to step back and examine what Lacan meant by the terms themselves. When he famously declared that the woman does not exist, he wasn't denying the reality of individual women. Rather, he was challenging the notion that there exists some universal category, some platonic ideal called woman that could serve as the perfect complement to man. In psychoanalytic terms, Lacan argued that humans don't relate to each other as complete, self-sufficient entities. Instead, we're fundamentally split subjects, divided by language, marked by unconscious desires we can't fully articulate or satisfy. When two people enter into what we call a sexual relationship, they aren't two complete halves coming together to form a perfect whole. They're two fractured beings, each pursuing something in the other that can never be fully grasped or obtained. Think about it this way. When you're attracted to someone, what are you really attracted to? Is it them, or is it some fantasy you've projected onto them? Is it their actual being, or the way they seem to complement some lack in yourself? Lacan would argue it's always the latter. We don't love the other person as they truly are. We love them for what they represent in our psychic economy, for how they seem to promise fulfillment of our deepest, most inchoate desires. This is why relationships are so fundamentally frustrating. The other person can never live up to the fantasy we've constructed around them. They can never truly get us in the way we long to be understood, and we can never get them either. Language, that medium through which we try to communicate our desires, always fails us at the crucial moment. There's always something that remains unsaid, untranslatable, caught in the gap between intention and expression.
The formulas of sexuation, beyond male and female. Lacan's theory becomes even more intriguing when we look at his formulas of sexuation, a series of mathematical-looking statements he developed late in his career. These formulas weren't meant to describe biological sex, or even gender identity in the contemporary sense. Instead, they outlined two different ways of relating to language, law, and desire, what Lacan called the masculine and feminine positions. Here's where it gets fascinating. These positions aren't tied to biological sex. Anyone, regardless of their anatomy, can occupy either position or oscillate between them. The masculine position involves being fully inscribed within the symbolic order, the world of language, law, and social rules. It's characterized by what Lacan called the phallic function, not because it has anything to do with penises, but because it represents a particular relationship to symbolic castration and limitation. Those who occupy the masculine position relate to desire through exception. They fantasize about an original father figure who wasn't bound by the law, who had access to unlimited jouissance, a term we'll explore more deeply in the next section. This mythical figure, Freud's primal father, supposedly had all the women, all the pleasure, with no restrictions. Of course, this figure never really existed. He's a necessary fantasy that structures masculine desire. The feminine position, by contrast, isn't entirely captured by the phallic function. There's something about feminine desire that exceeds the symbolic order, that can't be fully articulated in language. Lacan famously said that woman, with a capital W, to indicate the universal category, doesn't exist precisely because feminine jouissance points towards something beyond language, beyond the law, something supplementary that can't be captured by masculine logic. This doesn't mean women are mysterious or irrational. It means that the feminine position involves a different relationship to the limits of language and desire. While masculine desire orbits around a central point, the fantasy of the exception, the primal father, feminine desire is not all. It's distributed differently, open to something supplementary beyond the phallic framework. Contemporary scholars have noted how prescient Lacan's formulas seem in our current moment of gender fluidity and non-binary identities. By decoupling these psychic positions from biological sex, Lacan anticipated contemporary insights about the performativity and flexibility of gender. You don't have to be a man to occupy the masculine position, and you don't have to be a woman to experience feminine jouissance. Why communication always fails? The impossibility of the sexual relationship ultimately comes down to the failure of communication. Lacan was obsessed with language, how it shapes us, how it fails us, how it creates the very unconscious we struggle to understand. His famous maxim that the unconscious is structured like a language meant that our deepest desires and fears are organized according to the same principles that govern speech: metaphor, metonymy, substitution, displacement. But language is inherently inadequate. Words can never fully capture the thing they're meant to represent. There's always a gap, a slippage, between the signifier, the word, and the signified, the concept or thing it points to. And this gap isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's constitutive of human subjectivity itself. When we try to communicate our desire to another person, when we try to say what we really want, what we really feel, we inevitably fail. Not because we're inarticulate, but because desire itself is fundamentally unconscious. We don't fully know what we want, and even if we think we know, the moment we try to put it into words, it transforms into something else. This is why couples fight about nothing. The argument that starts about who did the dishes or what time someone came home is never really about dishes or time. It's about an underlying structure of desire and demand that can never be fully articulated. Each partner is trying to get something from the other: recognition, validation, proof of love. But the demand always misses its mark. The words we use to express our needs are always approximations, always inadequate. Lacan called this the distinction between need, demand, and desire. Need is biological: hunger, thirst.
Why communication always fails. The impossibility of the sexual relationship ultimately comes down to the failure of communication. Lacan was obsessed with language, how it shapes us, how it fails us, how it creates the very unconscious we struggle to understand. His famous maxim that the unconscious is structured like language meant that our deepest desires and fears are organized according to the same principles that govern speech: metaphor, metonymy, substitution, displacement. But language is inherently inadequate. Words can never fully capture the thing they're meant to represent. There's always a gap, a slippage between the signifier, the word, and the signified, the concept or thing it points to. And this gap isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's constitutive of human subjectivity itself. When we try to communicate our desire to another person, when we try to say what we really want, what we really feel, we inevitably fail. Not because we're inarticulate, but because desire itself is fundamentally unconscious. We don't fully know what we want. And even if we think we know, the moment we try to put it into words, it transforms into something else. This is why couples fight about nothing. The argument that starts about who did the dishes or what time someone came home is never really about dishes or time. It's about an underlying structure of desire and demand that can never be fully articulated. Each partner is trying to get something from the other: recognition, validation, proof of love. But the demand always misses its mark. The words we use to express our needs are always approximations, always inadequate. Lacan called this the distinction between need, demand, and desire. Need is biological: hunger, thirst, the need for warmth. Demand is what we express in language: the request for food, drink, a blanket. But desire is what remains unsatisfied even when needs are met and demands are answered. Desire is the remainder, the surplus that language can't capture. It's what we really want, but can never say. In the sexual relationship, or rather in the impossibility of the sexual relationship, this gap becomes most apparent. We seek in the other person some ultimate satisfaction, some final answer to our longing. But the other person is also a desiring subject, also marked by lack, also searching for something they can't name. Two lacks don't make a fullness. Two partial beings don't create completion. This might sound depressing, but Lacan didn't see it that way. For him, this fundamental impossibility was also what made love, real love, possible. Love isn't about finding your missing half or achieving perfect understanding. Love is about recognizing the irreducible otherness of the other person, about accepting that you'll never fully possess or understand them, and choosing to remain in relation anyway. Love, in Lacan's formulation, is giving what you don't have to someone who doesn't want it. This sounds like a joke, but it captures something profound. What we give in love isn't some positive quality or possession, but our very lack itself. We offer our incompleteness, our vulnerability, our fundamental not knowing. And what the other person desires isn't this gift exactly, because their desire is unconscious and oriented towards something else entirely. But in that very mismatch, in that failure of perfect communion, something like genuine intimacy becomes possible.
The political dimension of sexual difference.
The impossibility of the sexual relationship isn't just a matter of personal psychology, it has profound political implications. If there's no natural harmony between masculine and feminine positions, no cosmic order that dictates proper gender roles and sexual arrangements, then all existing social structures around gender and sexuality are contingent, made by humans, and therefore changeable. This is why Lacan's work has been so influential in feminist theory and queer theory, despite, or perhaps because of, its difficulty and occasionally problematic formulations. Thinkers like Juliet Mitchell, Jacqueline Rose, and Judith Butler have found in Lacan a way to theorize gender as something constructed through language and social interaction, rather than determined by biology. When Lacan says, "the woman does not exist," he's attacking biological essentialism, the idea that there's some natural, unchanging essence that defines femininity. Instead, femininity and masculinity are positions within a symbolic order, ways of relating to language and law. This means they're historical, cultural, and above all, political. The contemporary debates about gender identity, trans rights, and the binary nature of sex itself seem to resonate with Lacanian insights. If masculine and feminine positions aren't tied to biological sex, if they represent psychic structures rather than anatomical facts, then the fluidity and multiplicity of gender identities becomes not just acceptable, but theoretically necessary. Of course, Lacan himself was a product of mid-20th century France, and his language sometimes bears the marks of that time and place. His language can be heteronormative, and he didn't anticipate many of the questions raised by contemporary gender theory. But his insistence on the non-natural, constructed character of sexual difference provides theoretical tools for deconstructing rigid gender categories. The no sexual relationship thesis also challenges the romantic ideology that dominates our culture. We're told that finding the one will complete us, that somewhere out there is a perfect match who will understand us completely and fill all our empty spaces. Hollywood has built an empire on this fantasy. But Lacan insists that this fantasy is precisely what keeps us stuck in repetitive, unsatisfying patterns. If we accept that no relationship will ever be perfect, that communication will always partially fail, that the other person will always remain somewhat opaque to us, if we accept all this, we might actually build more honest, more sustainable relationships. We stop demanding that our partner be everything to us, stop expecting them to read our minds, stop feeling betrayed when they don't automatically understand what we need. The impossibility of the sexual relationship is ultimately about accepting limitation, finitude, and separation. It's about giving up the fantasy of complete fusion with another person and accepting the more difficult, more rewarding challenge of loving someone who remains irreducibly other.
Why we secretly enjoy our own suffering. One of Lacan's most unsettling concepts is jouissance, a French term that has no perfect English equivalent. It's often translated as enjoyment, but this is misleading. Jouissance isn't simple pleasure, it's a kind of painful pleasure, or pleasurable pain that exceeds the boundaries of what we normally think of as satisfaction. Freud identified something similar with his concept of the death drive, a compulsion that makes us repeat painful experiences, return to trauma, and pursue things that harm us. But Lacan's jouissance is more specific and more troubling. It points to the ways we take a perverse satisfaction in our own suffering, how we become attached to our symptoms, how we sabotage our own happiness in ways we don't consciously understand. Think about someone in a toxic relationship who keeps going back, knowing full well it will end badly. Or the person who works themselves into stress and exhaustion, complaining constantly but unable to change. Or the gambler who keeps betting despite mounting losses. These aren't just bad habits or weak willpower. They represent a deeper attachment to a particular mode of painful enjoyment. Jouissance is what lies beyond the pleasure principle, Freud's idea that humans seek pleasure and avoid pain. Lacan noticed that this principle actually doesn't govern human behavior. We don't just seek pleasure, we seek something more excessive, something that pushes beyond comfortable satisfaction into a zone of intensity that's both attractive and unbearable. This is why Lacan said there's a jouissance beyond the pleasure principle. We can only handle so much straightforward pleasure before it becomes overwhelming, even painful. But somehow we keep seeking more. We push past the point of comfortable satisfaction into territories of excess, whether through drugs, sex, work, exercise, food, or any number of other pursuits. The concept becomes even more interesting when we consider how jouissance relates to the body. For Lacan, jouissance is always, in some sense, bodily. It's registered in the flesh, in the material substance of our existence. But it's also structured by language and symbolic relations. This is the paradox. Jouissance is both radically physical and inescapably mediated by culture, language, and meaning.
The addictive thrill that leads to ruin. Contemporary addiction research has begun to recognize patterns that sound remarkably Lacanian. Addicts often report that they don't even enjoy their substance of choice anymore, but they can't stop using. The initial pleasure has long since faded, replaced by a grim compulsion. What are they pursuing? From a Lacanian perspective, they're pursuing jouissance, a satisfaction that's no longer satisfying, a pleasure that's become indistinguishable from pain. The addict knows rationally that continued use will destroy their health, relationships, and life prospects. But there's a deeper knowledge, an unconscious knowledge, that says, this is my jouissance, this is my mode of being, and I can't give it up without losing something essential. This helps explain why addiction is so resistant to rational intervention. You can't simply convince someone to stop pursuing their jouissance by explaining the negative consequences. Conscious understanding isn't the issue. The problem is that jouissance has become bound up with their very identity, with their way of managing the fundamental anxiety of existence. Lacan distinguished between different types of jouissance. There's the jouissance of the drive, the satisfaction we get from repetitive behaviors that circle around an object without ever fully grasping it. Think of obsessive-compulsive rituals, or the way we check our phones hundreds of times a day. The behavior itself provides a kind of satisfaction independent of any external goal. Then there's phallic jouissance, the satisfaction bound up with the symbolic order, with language and social recognition. This is the jouissance of achievement, of being seen and acknowledged, of having your worth validated by others. But because it depends on external recognition, it's always precarious, always requiring more. And finally, there's the enigmatic other jouissance, the jouissance that escapes the phallic framework, that points towards something beyond language and social meaning. This is what Lacan associated with the feminine position, though, as we discussed earlier, it's not biologically tied to women. It's a jouissance that can't be spoken, can't be captured in narrative or explanation.
The painful pleasure of symptoms. One of the most clinically useful aspects of Lacan's jouissance concept is how it illuminates the persistence of symptoms. In traditional therapy, there's often an assumption that once someone understands the root cause of their symptom, it will disappear. But this frequently doesn't happen. People gain insight into their patterns and continue repeating them anyway. Why? Because symptoms aren't just problems to be solved, they're also solutions, compromises that allow us to manage impossible demands and contradictions. More than that, symptoms are modes of jouissance. We're attached to them not despite the suffering they cause, but in some sense because of it. Consider anxiety. On the surface, no one wants to be anxious. It's uncomfortable, limiting, exhausting. But anxiety also provides a certain satisfaction. It gives life intensity and meaning. It structures our relationship to the future. It even provides a kind of identity. I'm an anxious person.
The idea of giving up anxiety entirely can be terrifying. Without it, who would I be? What would I feel? This doesn't mean anxiety is fake or that people want to suffer. It means the psychic economy is complex. Symptoms serve multiple functions simultaneously. They express something that can't be said directly. They protect us from something more threatening, and they provide a familiar form of satisfaction, however painful. Lacan's genius was recognizing that you can't simply remove a symptom without understanding what jouissance it provides. The symptom must be traversed. We must come to understand our attachment to it, what satisfaction it gives us, what it shields us from. Only then can we begin to reorganize our relationship to it. This is radically different from symptom management approaches that try to eliminate problematic behaviors through conditioning or willpower. Lacanian analysis asks, what is this symptom doing for you? What enjoyment, however painful, does it provide? The answer is never simple or obvious. It requires diving deep into the specific structure of each person's unconscious, their particular history, their unique way of managing desire and anxiety.
Cultural jouissance. How society structures our pain. Jouissance isn't just individual, it's also cultural. Different societies, different historical periods, organize and regulate jouissance in different ways. What counts as acceptable enjoyment? What pleasures are prohibited? How do we manage the excess of human desire within social structures? Lacan noticed that every society needs to establish some relationship to jouissance, some way of channeling and limiting it. Completely unrestricted jouissance would tear apart the social fabric. Imagine if everyone simply acted on every impulse, pursued every satisfaction regardless of consequences. But completely eliminating jouissance is impossible. Human beings need some outlet for this excessive, painful pleasure. The result is a complex economy where certain forms of jouissance are permitted, regulated, and even encouraged. Think of consumer culture's promise of satisfaction through purchase, while others are prohibited and driven underground. Religion, morality, law, all these can be understood as different systems for managing collective jouissance. What's fascinating is that the prohibited forms of jouissance often become the most powerful. Transgression itself becomes a source of jouissance. This is why puritanical societies often produce the most intense obsessions with precisely what they forbid. The Victorian era's repression of sexuality led to an explosive proliferation of pornography, prostitution, and perverse practices, all the more intense for being forbidden. In our contemporary moment, we're witnessing fascinating shifts in how jouissance is organized. Consumer capitalism has developed sophisticated methods for channeling jouissance into commodity consumption. We're promised satisfaction through products, experiences, identities we can purchase. But this promise is always deferred. There's always something new to buy, a new experience to have, a new identity to try on. Social media has created entirely new forms of jouissance. The dopamine hit of likes and comments, the compulsive scrolling, the strange satisfaction of doom scrolling through bad news. We know it's making us unhappy, but we can't stop. This is classic jouissance, a painful pleasure we're driven to repeat despite or because of its negative effects. Political movements, too, can be understood through jouissance. The satisfaction people get from outrage, from belonging to a cause, from hating the enemy. These aren't rational calculations. They're investments of jouissance. This helps explain why political discourse has become so toxic and polarized. People aren't just defending positions, they're defending their modes of enjoyment.
The clinical challenge: working with jouissance. For practicing psychoanalysts, jouissance presents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that you can't simply tell someone to give up their painful enjoyment. That would be like trying to pull away someone's crutches without teaching them to walk. The opportunity is that understanding someone's particular economy of jouissance provides a roadmap for therapeutic work. What are they getting from their symptom? What would they have to give up to change? What new forms of satisfaction might become possible? Lacanian analysis proceeds by helping the analysand recognize their own jouissance, not to judge it, but to understand it. This requires a particular kind of listening. The analyst attends not just to what's said, but to how it's said, to what's repeated, to what produces intensity or resistance or laughter or silence. The goal isn't to eliminate jouissance. That would be impossible and undesirable. Jouissance is part of what makes us human, part of what gives life intensity and meaning. The goal is to help the person develop a different relationship to their jouissance, one that's less destructive, more flexible, more compatible with living in the world with others. This might mean accepting certain forms of enjoyment you've been fighting against. It might mean recognizing how you've been sabotaging your own desires. It might mean finding new, less painful ways to satisfy the same underlying drive. The process is different for everyone because each person's unconscious is unique, structured by their particular history and circumstances. What remains constant is the Lacanian insight that we're not transparent to ourselves, that our suffering isn't simply imposed from outside, and that we're more attached to our pain than we'd like to admit. These aren't comfortable realizations, but they're necessary steps toward any genuine change.
The knot that holds your sanity together. In his late seminars, particularly in his exploration of James Joyce's writing, Lacan developed one of his most intriguing and difficult concepts, the synthome. The word itself is an archaic French spelling of symptom, but it represents something very different from the traditional psychoanalytic symptom. If symptoms are formations of the unconscious that can be analyzed and dissolved through interpretation, synthomes are more fundamental structures that hold together the psyche itself. They're like knots that bind the three registers of human experience, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, preventing them from flying apart. Think of it this way. Your personality isn't a solid, unified thing. It's more like a precarious assemblage held together by particular patterns, habits, and fixations. The synthome is what keeps this assemblage from disintegrating. It's your particular way of managing the fundamental contradiction and impossibility of human existence. Lacan developed this concept through his reading of James Joyce, whose experimental writing he saw as a kind of literary synthome. Joyce's language, dense, punning, multilingual, barely comprehensible, wasn't just artistic innovation. It was Joyce's way of holding himself together, of managing what might otherwise have been psychotic disintegration. For Joyce, writing in this peculiar style wasn't optional, it was necessary. His relationship to language was such that he needed to break it apart and reassemble it in his own idiosyncratic way. This wasn't a symptom that could be analyzed away, it was the very structure that made Joyce's subjectivity possible.
How your mind is a mathematical puzzle. Lacan, in his later work, became increasingly interested in mathematical formalization, particularly in topology, the study of spatial properties that remain unchanged under continuous transformation. He saw topological structures like Mobius strips, tori, and most importantly, Borromean knots as models for psychic structure. The Borromean knot consists of 3 rings linked together in such a way that if any one ring is cut, all 3 come apart. This perfectly captured Lacan's idea of the 3 registers: the real, the realm of the traumatic, the impossible, what resists symbolization; the symbolic, the realm of language, law, and social meaning; and the imaginary, the realm of images, identifications, and the mirror stage. In normal neurotic structure,
These three registers are held together by what Lacan called the name of the father, a function related to paternal law and symbolic authority that provides stability. But what about people who lack this function? Classically, psychoanalysis said they would be psychotic, unable to function in reality. But Lacan noticed that many people who should be psychotic according to traditional theory managed to function quite well. They'd found another way to hold the rings together. This is what he called the synthome, a fourth ring that could supplement the Borromean knot, keeping it intact even when the name of the father was missing or deficient. Joyce was Lacan's primary example. Joyce's relationship to his father was deeply problematic. The paternal function didn't work for him in the traditional way. But through his writing, through his unique relationship to language, Joyce created a synthome that prevented psychotic breakdown. His art was therapeutic not in the sense of curing illness, but in the sense of providing structure where structure was lacking.
Synthome, your own personal creative glitch. What makes the synthome concept so fascinating is its positive valence. Unlike symptoms, which are seen as problems to overcome, the synthome is necessary and valuable. It's your particular way of being human, your singular solution to the impossible problem of existence. Everyone has a synthome, even if they're not aware of it. It might be a creative pursuit, an obsessive interest, a peculiar habit, a distinctive style. It's something that seems excessive, unnecessary, even pathological from the outside, but which provides essential structure from the inside. Think of the person who must organize their books in a very specific way, or the musician who practices scales for hours every day, or the programmer who gets lost in code for entire weekends. These aren't just hobbies or interests, they're ways of managing psychic structure, of giving shape and meaning to existence. The synthome is often tied to what we call passion or vocation. It's what you do that doesn't make rational sense, but which you can't give up without losing yourself. It's your particular madness, your creative glitch, your necessary excess. What distinguishes the synthome from mere symptom is that it's no longer oriented toward meaning. You don't do it because it means something, you do it because it's how you exist. It's become part of your being rather than a message from your unconscious. This is why Lacan saw identification with the synthome as the endpoint of analysis. Early in his career, he thought analysis aimed at traversing the fantasy, at seeing through the fundamental fantasies that structure your desire. But later, he recognized that something more was needed. You don't just dissolve your illusions, you come to accept and even embrace your particular mode of being, however strange or idiosyncratic it might appear.
Creating your synthome, the artistic solution. Not everyone is James Joyce, obviously, but Lacan's point was that everyone faces the same basic problem: how to hold together the disparate elements of experience. How to create consistency where there is fundamentally gap and rupture. And everyone solves this problem in their own way. For some, the solution is artistic. They create work that expresses something they can't say any other way. The creative process itself becomes necessary, not for external recognition or success, but for internal coherence. This is different from art as symptom, which expresses unconscious meaning, or art as sublimation, which redirects sexual energy. Art as synthome is more fundamental. It's constitutive of subjectivity itself. But the synthome doesn't have to be artistic in the conventional sense. It can be any practice or pattern that provides essential structure. For some people, it's a spiritual practice. For others, it's physical, running, martial arts, dance. For others, it's intellectual, reading, writing, thinking through problems. What matters is that it's singular, yours and yours alone. The synthome can't be prescribed or taught. You can't adopt someone else's synthome any more than you can adopt their fingerprints. It emerges from your particular history, your unique way of being split by language, your singular response to the trauma of existence. This is why the end of Lacanian analysis isn't about conforming to some norm or ideal of health. It's about recognizing and accepting your particularity, your difference, your way of being that doesn't fit cleanly into social categories. You learn to stop trying to be normal and to embrace being yourself, however weird, excessive, or inexplicable that self might be.
The ethics of the synthome. There's an ethical dimension to the synthome that Lacan emphasized late in his teaching. If your synthome is what makes you you, then being true to it is a matter of ethical responsibility. To betray your synthome, to give up what's most singular about you in order to fit in, to please others, to be reasonable, is a kind of existential bad faith. This doesn't mean indulging every impulse or refusing all social constraint. The synthome isn't about transgression for its own sake. It's about finding a way to exist that's both authentically yours and compatible with living among others. It's about creating your own law rather than simply submitting to external authority. Lacan often invoked the psychoanalytic imperative, do not give up on your desire. This is closely related to the ethics of the synthome. Your desire is bound up with your particular way of being, your singular mode of enjoyment. To abandon it completely is to abandon yourself. But this is also frightening. Most people spend their lives trying to become normal, acceptable, comprehensible to others. The idea of embracing your own strangeness, your own peculiar form of enjoyment, goes against every social pressure to conform. It requires a kind of courage. This is where Lacan's late teaching becomes almost spiritual. He's talking about something like authenticity, but without the humanist baggage. You're not discovering some pre-existing true self. You're creating a mode of existence, a way of living with contradiction and impossibility. The synthome is your creation, your art, your particular way of being human.
How to see Lacan's theories everywhere. One of the most exciting aspects of Lacanian theory is how it provides tools for analyzing cultural phenomena. Once you understand the basic concepts, desire, jouissance, the real, fantasy, the synthome, you start seeing them everywhere. Films, politics, social media, advertising, everything can be read through a Lacanian lens. This isn't just academic game-playing. Lacanian cultural analysis reveals hidden structures, unconscious patterns, and ideological operations that shape our experience without our awareness. It helps us understand why we're attracted to certain narratives, why certain political messages resonate, why advertising works, why we can't stop scrolling. The key is learning to read symptomatically, to look for what's not being said, what's repeated obsessively, what produces anxiety or enjoyment. Lacanian analysis attends to gaps, contradictions, and excesses. It asks, what desire is being expressed here? What jouissance is being pursued? What impossible demand structures this situation?
Unlocking the Matrix, Joker, and Fight Club with one idea. Let's start with some concrete examples. These three films, The Matrix, Fight Club, and Joker, have become cultural touchstones, endlessly analyzed and referenced. They resonate with something in contemporary experience. But what? The Matrix is perhaps the most overtly philosophical mainstream film ever made, explicitly referencing Descartes, Baudrillard, and yes, even Lacan. The film's basic premise, that reality is a simulation, that we're living in a dream, mirrors Lacan's insistence that we never have direct access to the real. Our experience is always mediated by symbolic systems, language, culture, and imaginary projections, fantasies, identifications. Neo's journey can be read as an allegory of analysis. He starts believing the fantasy that he's just an ordinary guy living an ordinary life. But something doesn't fit. There's a gap, a glitch, a sense that something's wrong. This is the role of the symptom. It marks the point where fantasy fails, where the real intrudes.
The red pill, blue pill choice is a choice about truth. Do you want to know what's really going on, or would you rather remain in comfortable ignorance? Most people choose the blue pill, even if they think they'd choose red. The truth is traumatic. Fantasy is comfortable. But here's where the film gets really Lacanian. Even after Neo takes the red pill, even after he wakes up, he's still not accessing pure reality. He's now in a different symbolic order that has its own rules, its own master figures, Morpheus, the Oracle, its own fantasy structure, the prophecy. The real isn't something you reach by going deeper into truth. The real is what remains inaccessible, what resists symbolization entirely. The film's fascination with choice and freedom is also Lacanian. Are we free if we're determined by unconscious patterns? Neo is told he's the one, but is this empowering or just another form of symbolic determination? The Oracle tells him he's not the one, but that he has the potential to become it. This perfectly captures Lacanian subjectivity. You're not determined by some essential nature, but you also don't have complete freedom. You become who you are through choices made in situations you didn't choose. Fight Club takes a different angle on similar themes. Tyler Durden, Brad Pitt's character, represents the return of what's been repressed, the masculine aggression, violence, and transgression that consumer capitalism promises to satisfy, but actually neuters. Tyler is the id to the narrator's superego, the jouissance that civilized life has forbidden. The unnamed narrator, Edward Norton, is the perfect contemporary subject, alienated, anxious, trying to find meaning through consumption and support groups. He's exactly what capitalist ideology wants, a perpetual consumer seeking satisfaction through commodity purchase. But something's missing. There's a lack that furniture from IKEA can't fill. Enter Tyler Durden, who promises authentic experience, real feeling, escape from the numbing effects of modern life. Fight Club, the underground boxing organization they create, provides raw jouissance, pain as pleasure, violence as authenticity, transgression as liberation. But here's the twist. Tyler's a fantasy, a projection of the narrator's unconscious desire. He doesn't actually exist as a separate person. This is the genius of the film's structure. Tyler represents the narrator's disavowed jouissance, the part of himself he can't consciously accept. The violence isn't coming from outside. It's his own surplus enjoyment that he's been trying to eliminate through endless consumption. The film's critique of consumer culture is Lacanian in its recognition that capitalism doesn't repress desire, it produces and manages it. We're not forbidden to enjoy, we're commanded to enjoy. Buy this product, have this experience, optimize your life. But this mandatory enjoyment is precisely what makes us miserable. The pressure to be happy, successful, fulfilled becomes its own form of oppression. Project Mayhem, the terrorist organization that emerges from Fight Club, represents the political dimension of jouissance. The destruction of credit card company buildings is meant to eliminate debt, to reset the symbolic order, to escape the law. But it also reveals the authoritarian core of anti-authoritarian movements. Tyler becomes a fascist leader, demanding total obedience, sacrificing individual members for the cause. The critique of consumer capitalism transforms into its mirror image. Joker, the 2019 Todd Phillips version, offers perhaps the most disturbing Lacanian case study. Arthur Fleck is a failed subject, rejected by society, abandoned by institutions, unable to achieve recognition. His descent into violence can be read as a response to the failure of the symbolic order to provide him with a viable subject position. Lacan emphasized that we become subjects through recognition by the other. The infant needs the mother's gaze, the child needs the father's law, the adult needs social acknowledgement. But what happens when this recognition is systematically denied? When you're invisible, when your suffering is dismissed, when every institution that's supposed to help you fails? Arthur's therapist doesn't really listen. The social services that provide his medication are defunded. His mother lied to him about his father. The TV host he idolizes humiliates him publicly. Every relationship that might anchor him in the symbolic order fails. The film's most chilling scene is Arthur's appearance on Murray Franklin's show. This should be his moment of recognition, appearing on TV, being seen by millions. But even here, he's not recognized as he wants to be. Murray wants him as a joke, not as a person. So he kills him, live on television. This murder transforms Arthur into Joker, not just a character, but a symbol. The disaffected people of Gotham adopt his clown makeup and his violence. He becomes the symptom of collective rage, the symptomatic expression of a society failing to provide meaningful subject positions for its members. The film is controversial because it seems to generate sympathy for a mass murderer. But from a Lacanian perspective, that's precisely the point. Arthur isn't evil. He's a subject who failed to achieve subjectivity within the given symbolic order. His violence is horrific, but it's also symptomatic. It tells us something about what's wrong with the society that produced him. The film also plays brilliantly with the boundary between reality and fantasy. We're never sure what actually happened and what Arthur imagined. Did he really have a relationship with his neighbor, or was that fantasy? Was the entire film a delusion? This ambiguity mirrors the Lacanian insight that we can't clearly separate reality from fantasy. Fantasy structures our perception of reality. Reality is always filtered through fantasy.
Reading politics through Lacan. Contemporary politics makes much more sense through a Lacanian lens. Political ideologies aren't just sets of rational beliefs. They're fantasy structures that organize desire and jouissance. They tell stories about who we are, who our enemies are, what's wrong with the world, and how to fix it. The populist movements sweeping across democracies, whether right-wing or left-wing, can be understood through Lacan's analysis of discourse. Populist leaders position themselves as embodying the will of the people against corrupt elites. But who are the people? It's a fantasy construction, a way of creating unity and identity where there is actually only difference and antagonism. The populist fantasy typically works like this. We were once whole, complete, happy. Then something went wrong. Someone stole our jouissance. The immigrants took our jobs. The elites betrayed us. The system is rigged. If we could only eliminate this obstacle, we could return to our original fullness. This is the myth of the primal father all over again. There was once an exception to the law, someone who had access to unlimited enjoyment. We've been castrated, limited, deprived of what's rightfully ours. The leader promises to restore what was stolen. But here's the thing. This original fullness never existed. It's a retroactive fantasy. The people were never unified. There was no golden age when everyone was satisfied. The story of stolen enjoyment is necessary to explain why we're not happy now, why desire remains unsatisfied. We need someone to blame. This is why conspiracy theories are so powerful. They provide an explanation for the fundamental dissatisfaction of human existence. You're not unhappy because desire is structurally unsatisfiable. You're unhappy because sinister forces are conspiring against you. If we could only expose and eliminate these forces, everything would be fine. Lacanian analysis reveals this as fantasy. No political program can restore original fullness because no such fullness existed. The promise of complete satisfaction is always deceptive. This doesn't mean politics doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But it means we should be suspicious of political movements that promise total solutions, that claim to represent unified subjects, the people, the nation, the race, that require scapegoats to explain why satisfaction remains out of reach. Social media and the economy of jouissance. Social media provides an almost laboratory-perfect illustration of Lacanian concepts. Consider the mechanism of the like.
When you post something and receive likes, what are you getting? Symbolic recognition, yes, but more than that, you're getting a hit of jouissance, a small satisfaction that's pleasurable but also never quite enough. No matter how many likes you get, you want more. The satisfaction is real but fleeting. This is jouissance in action. Pleasure that pushes beyond the pleasure principle, that can never be fully satisfied, that creates a compulsive need for repetition. The scroll itself has become a contemporary form of drive. You check your phone not to find something specific, but because the activity of checking has become satisfying in itself. The drive doesn't aim at a final goal, it aims at continuation. The satisfaction is in the circuit, not the destination. Social media platforms have engineered their interfaces to maximize jouissance. Variable reward schedules, infinite scrolling, notification badges, these aren't bugs, they're features designed to keep you engaged. The platforms understand, probably better than their users, how to capture and direct human jouissance. The performance of identity on social media is also deeply Lacanian. We construct ourselves for the gaze of the other. We present curated versions of our lives, seeking validation and recognition. But the self-representing is itself a fantasy. Not exactly fake, but not exactly real either. It's what we want to be seen as, which reveals what we desire in the other's desire. The anxiety around social media, addiction, comparison, FOMO, stems from this structure. We're caught in a loop where we seek satisfaction through symbolic recognition, but the recognition we receive is never quite what we wanted. We get likes, but not from the right people. We get comments, but they don't say what we hoped. The other's desire remains enigmatic, inaccessible.
Advertising and the promise of the object. Advertising is applied Lacanian theory, whether advertisers know it or not. Every advertisement makes a basic promise. This product will satisfy you. Not just satisfy a specific need, but satisfy you, make you complete, whole, happy. This is what Lacan called object petit a, the object cause of desire. It's not that we desire the object itself, the car, the phone, the vacation. We desire what we fantasize the object will make us. We desire the wholeness, the satisfaction, the recognition we imagined possessing this object will bring. But here's the trick that keeps capitalism running. The object can never deliver on this promise. Not because individual products are deficient, but because no object can fill the lack that constitutes human subjectivity. We're fundamentally lacking beings. This lack isn't a problem to be solved, but a condition of existence. So we buy the product, and we feel satisfaction, briefly. Then the lack returns. So we need another product, and another. The cycle is endless because the promise is impossible. But we can't stop believing in it, because to give up on this promise would be to accept our fundamental limitation, our constitutive lack. Advertising doesn't really sell products, it sells fantasy structures. The product is just a placeholder, a way of accessing the fantasy. This is why luxury brands can charge premium prices. They're not just selling material goods, they're selling subject positions, identities, ways of relating to the symbolic order. The genius of contemporary marketing is that it's moved beyond selling products to selling experiences, lifestyles, identities. You're not buying shoes, you're buying the opportunity to just do it, to identify with a brand that represents athleticism, determination, transcendence. The product becomes the entry point into a fantasy world.
The case against Lacan, is it all just pseudoscience? Now that we've explored Lacan's ideas sympathetically, we need to confront the serious criticisms. Because, let's be honest, Lacan is an incredibly problematic thinker. His writing is deliberately obscure, often to the point of incomprehensibility. His theoretical claims are unfalsifiable. His clinical evidence is anecdotal at best. And his personal behavior, running 5-minute sessions, cultivating a cult of personality, treating patients and students poorly, raises serious ethical questions. The most fundamental criticism is that psychoanalysis in general, and Lacanian psychoanalysis in particular, isn't scientific. It makes claims that can't be tested empirically. You can't falsify the concept of the unconscious or measure jouissance in a laboratory. The theory is constructed so that any evidence can be interpreted to support it. If someone rejects a Lacanian interpretation, that rejection itself can be read as resistance, as proof that the interpretation is correct. Karl Popper famously argued that psychoanalysis fails the criterion of falsifiability that distinguishes science from pseudoscience. Freud's and Lacan's theories can explain any behavior after the fact, but they can't predict specific outcomes in advance. This makes them unfalsifiable, and therefore, according to Popper, unscientific. There's real force to this criticism. Lacanian analysts don't conduct randomized controlled trials. They don't use standardized diagnostic criteria or treatment protocols. Each analysis is unique, guided by theoretical concepts, but without systematic method. How do we know if it works? We have testimonials, case studies, theoretical arguments, but no solid empirical evidence. Cognitive behavioral therapy, by contrast, has been extensively tested. We know from controlled studies that CBT is effective for treating depression, anxiety, and other conditions. We understand the mechanisms by which it works. We can predict outcomes with reasonable accuracy. Can Lacanian analysis make similar claims? The honest answer is no. Lacanian analysts would argue that their work can't be tested in the same way, because the unconscious isn't a natural object amenable to quantitative measurement. Each analand's unconscious is singular, structured by their unique history and language. Standardization would eliminate precisely what makes analysis effective. This is philosophically coherent, but practically problematic. If the work can't be evaluated by ordinary standards of evidence, how do we distinguish effective analysis from ineffective analysis, from therapeutic manipulation, from pure charlatanism? The Lacanian response that only someone who's undergone analysis themselves can understand sounds suspiciously like special pleading.
The holes in the world's most complicated theory. Even if we grant psychoanalysis some validity as a practice, Lacan's specific theoretical contributions face serious problems. His mathematical formalizations, for instance, have been criticized as misusing mathematical concepts. Physicist Alan Sokal and mathematician Jean Bricmont, in their book Fashionable Nonsense, argue that Lacan uses mathematical terminology without understanding what the terms actually mean. For example, Lacan claimed that the structure of the neurotic subject is a torus. But what does this really mean? Is he claiming that brain structure is topologically equivalent to a torus? That's obviously false. Is he claiming that certain psychic processes can be modeled topologically? Perhaps, but he never specifies how this modeling would work or what predictions it would generate. The suspicion is that Lacan used mathematics not for precision, but for obscurity, to make his ideas seem more rigorous and scientific than they actually are. The mathematics is performative rather than functional. It impresses readers who don't understand topology while saying nothing substantive. His linguistic theory also has problems. Lacan claimed the unconscious is structured like a language, borrowing heavily from structural linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. But contemporary linguistics has moved far beyond Saussure. Chomsky's generative grammar, cognitive linguistics, embodied cognition theories, all these suggest the relationship between language and thought is far more complex than Lacan's model suggests. Moreover, linguistic evidence contradicts some of Lacan's specific claims. He argued that signifiers are arbitrary. The sound tree has no inherent connection to actual trees. This is true for most words. But research on sound symbolism, iconicity, and embodied metaphor suggests language isn't as arbitrary as structuralist theory assumed. There are systematic relationships between sound and meaning that Lacan's model can't account for. His theories about sexual difference are also deeply problematic. While Lacan attempted to denaturalize gender, his formulations still rely on phallocentric assumptions. Why is the organizing principle of sexuality phallic? Even if we accept it's not about biological penises, the choice of terminology reveals assumptions about masculinity and activity being primary, femininity and passivity being secondary. Feminist critics like Luce Irigaray have argued that Lacan's entire theoretical edifice is structured by masculine bias. The not all of feminine jouissance, for instance, is defined negatively as what escapes phallic logic. But why should phallic logic be the norm from which feminine sexuality deviates? This seems to replicate rather than challenge patriarchal structures.
The problem of clinical evidence. Perhaps the most damning criticism concerns Lacan's clinical practice. He developed a technique of variable length sessions, sometimes lasting only 5 or 10 minutes. His justification was that sessions should end at moments of maximum significance, when something crucial has been revealed. This would mark the insight more powerfully than arbitrary time limits. But this practice is ethically dubious. Clients paid for full sessions but often received only a few minutes. There was no clear standard for when to end. It was entirely at the analyst's discretion. This created an asymmetrical power relationship where the analyst had complete control. Moreover, we have almost no detailed case studies from Lacan himself. Unlike Freud, who published extensive case histories, Dora, the Rat Man, the Wolf Man, Lacan rarely discussed specific cases in detail. We have his theoretical elaborations, but little evidence of how these theories actually played out in clinical work. The few accounts we have from former analysts are mixed. Some report profound experiences of transformation. Others describe confusion, manipulation, and harm. One former patient described Lacan as a genius who is also a complete asshole. Without systematic outcome data, we're left with conflicting testimonials and no way to evaluate effectiveness. The institutional history of Lacanian psychoanalysis also raises questions. Lacan was expelled from the International Psychoanalytic Association for his controversial practices. He then founded his own school, which later split amid bitter disputes. Lacanian institutions have been plagued by sectarianism, personal rivalries, and cult-like dynamics. This doesn't necessarily invalidate the theory, but it suggests something problematic about how Lacanian analysis functions as a practice. When a therapeutic approach generates more conflict than healing among its own practitioners, that's worrying. The accessibility problem. There's also a straightforward practical criticism. Lacan is nearly impossible to understand. His seminars were delivered in dense French, playing on words that don't translate. His writing deliberately avoids clarity, using neologisms, puns, and allusions that even experts struggle to decode. Defenders argue this difficulty is necessary, that Lacan's subject matter, the unconscious, the real, resists straightforward expression. The obscurity isn't a bug, it's a feature. You have to work with the text, struggle with it, let it affect you unconsciously. But there's a fine line between productive difficulty and deliberate obfuscation. When a thinker makes their work so difficult that only a select few can claim to understand it, they create conditions for interpretive authority. Certain approved readers become gatekeepers who determine what Lacan really meant. This is how cults of personality develop. Moreover, the inaccessibility creates practical barriers. If Lacanian ideas have value, shouldn't they be available to people without advanced training in continental philosophy? The elitism built into Lacanian discourse, the assumption that only certain readers are sophisticated enough to understand, is intellectually and politically problematic. When the emperor has no clothes. So is Lacan just an intellectual fraud? An emperor with no clothes, impressive only to those who don't want to admit they can't see anything? The answer, frustratingly, is both yes and no. Yes, there's genuine insight in Lacan's work. His concepts provide powerful tools for analyzing culture, understanding subjectivity, and thinking about desire. Many people have found Lacanian analysis therapeutically valuable.
His influence on philosophy, literary theory, and cultural studies has been profound and lasting. But yes, there's also nonsense. The mathematical formalization is often empty. The obscurity sometimes serves no purpose beyond mystification. The clinical practice raised serious ethical issues. The institutional dynamics have been toxic. And the unfalsifiability of core claims makes it impossible to distinguish truth from elaborate confabulation. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Lacan is a brilliant but deeply flawed thinker. He identified genuine problems with ego psychology and adapted psychoanalysis to linguistic and structural insights, but he also cultivated obscurity, encouraged dependence, and made claims beyond what his evidence could support. The value of engaging with Lacan depends on what you're looking for. If you want scientifically validated therapeutic techniques, look elsewhere, CBT, DBT, or evidence-based psychotherapy. If you want clear, systematic philosophy, read someone else. But if you want provocative ideas about desire, language, and subjectivity, ideas that challenge common sense and force you to think differently about yourself and culture, then Lacan still offers something valuable. Just approach with critical skepticism and don't drink all the Kool-Aid.
Why we still can't escape Lacan. Despite all the criticisms, despite the obscurity and the scandals and the legitimate questions about scientific validity, Lacan won't go away. His ideas keep circulating, keep influencing new generations of thinkers, keep appearing in unexpected places. Why? Part of the answer is that Lacan addressed problems that haven't gone away. How do we understand consciousness and unconsciousness? How does language shape thought? What is desire, and why is it never satisfied? How do we become subjects within social structures? These aren't questions that get resolved. They remain perpetually open. Moreover, Lacan's insights have proven remarkably applicable to contemporary phenomena. Social media, identity politics, conspiracy theories, consumer culture, all these make more sense through a Lacanian lens. His concepts give us tools for understanding aspects of experience that other frameworks struggle to capture. The global spread of Lacanian ideas is also significant. While Lacan started in Paris, his influence has become worldwide. There are active Lacanian schools and institutes in Latin America, Europe, Asia, Australia. Lacanian analysis has been adapted to different cultural contexts, showing surprising flexibility. In some ways, Lacan has become more relevant as his historical moment recedes. The mid-20th century French intellectual scene that produced him seems distant now. But the problems he identified, alienation, the failure of recognition, the impossibility of satisfaction, the gap between intention and expression, these feel increasingly urgent in our digitized, globalized, late capitalist moment. The battle for Lacan's soul, his final legacy. Since Lacan's death in 1981, there has been an ongoing struggle over his legacy. Different schools and interpreters emphasize different aspects of his work, sometimes arriving at incompatible conclusions. Some emphasize the early Lacan of the 1950s, the thinker of the mirror stage and the symbolic order, engaged with Hegelian philosophy and Kojève's reading of the master-slave dialectic. This Lacan is more humanist, more concerned with intersubjectivity and recognition. Others prioritize the middle Lacan of the 1960s, the thinker of the real and the object influenced by Claude Lévi-Strauss's structuralism and concerned with the limits of interpretation. This Lacan is more radical, emphasizing what resists symbolization and meaning. Still others focus on the late Lacan of the 1970s, the thinker of jouissance and the symptome, engaged with topology and mathematical formalization, moving beyond traditional psychoanalytic categories.
this Lacan is the most difficult and most original, pointing towards something almost mystical. These different Lacans aren't easily reconciled. They represent different trajectories, different emphases, different ways of thinking about subjectivity and the unconscious. Each has its advocates and institutional embodiments. Perhaps the most influential interpreter of Lacan has been Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher who's become something of an intellectual celebrity. Žižek reads Lacan through German idealism, especially Hegel, and applies Lacanian concepts to contemporary politics and popular culture. His work has made Lacan accessible to wider audiences, though without controversy. Žižek's Lacan is politically radical, emphasizing antagonism, the real as traumatic kernel, and the critique of ideology. Through films like The Matrix and Alien, through analyzing contemporary politics and social movements, Žižek shows Lacan's relevance to understanding our current moment. But Žižek's interpretation is also contested. Some argue he overemphasizes negativity and antagonism, neglecting Lacan's more nuanced views. Others suggest he uses Lacan opportunistically, bending concepts to fit predetermined political conclusions. The debate continues.
Lacan in the age of neuroscience. One of the most interesting contemporary developments is the encounter between Lacanian psychoanalysis and neuroscience. These should be incompatible frameworks, one concerned with meaning and interpretation, the other with brain mechanisms and neurochemistry, but some theorists are finding surprising points of connection. The field of neuropsychoanalysis attempts to integrate psychoanalytic insights with neuroscientific findings. While most of this work has been Freudian, there's growing interest in Lacanian concepts. How might we understand the unconscious in neural terms? What brain mechanisms might underlie drive and jouissance? How does neuroplasticity relate to psychoanalytic change? These questions are controversial. Many Lacanians argue that reducing psychoanalysis to neuroscience misses the entire point. The unconscious isn't a brain region, it's structured like a language. Desire can't be located in a neural circuit. The attempt to naturalize psychoanalysis destroys what makes it distinctive. But others see potential for productive dialogue. Perhaps neuroimaging can reveal patterns that correspond to psychoanalytic phenomena. Perhaps understanding neural mechanisms can inform therapeutic technique. Perhaps the two frameworks, while operating at different levels of analysis, can illuminate different aspects of the same territory. The debate parallels earlier discussions about the scientific status of psychoanalysis. Is it a rival to neuroscience, making incompatible claims about the same phenomena, or is it a different kind of enterprise entirely, concerned with meaning rather than mechanism? There's no consensus. What seems clear is that neither framework will simply replace the other. Neuroscience continues advancing, mapping neural networks and identifying molecular mechanisms. Lacanian analysis continues evolving, addressing new clinical and cultural phenomena. Both have their domains of validity. Lacan and digital culture. Perhaps the most exciting frontier for Lacanian theory is its application to digital culture. The internet, social media, virtual reality, AI, these technologies are transforming human subjectivity in ways that demand theoretical engagement. Some Lacanian thinkers argue that digital culture represents a fundamental shift in the structure of the symbolic order. Language itself is changing, shortened to tweets, fragmented into memes, mediated through algorithmic curation. What happens to the unconscious when the symbolic order transforms so rapidly? Virtual identity, the self we present online, raises questions about the imaginary register and identification. When you create an avatar, construct a profile, filter your photos, you're engaged in a process of self-fashioning. But this self is both more controlled, you choose what to present, and less stable. It exists only in relation to others' responses, the number of likes and comments. Artificial intelligence presents perhaps the deepest challenge. If AI systems can generate language that seems meaningful, that responds to human input in apparently intelligent ways, what does this mean for Lacan's insistence that the unconscious is structured like a language? If language can exist without human subjectivity, does this undermine psychoanalytic theory? or perhaps it confirms it. Maybe AI reveals that language always was a system that exceeds individual speakers. The symbolic order never belonged to any particular subject. It's a transpersonal structure that subjects plug into. AI just makes this more obvious by showing that linguistic competence doesn't require human consciousness. These questions are just beginning to be explored. Digital culture is evolving so quickly that theory struggles to keep pace. But Lacan's concepts, the gaze, the other, desires, jouissance, provide surprisingly useful tools for thinking about these new phenomena. The continuing relevance of the real. If there's one Lacanian concept that seems especially important for our current moment, it's the real. In a world of fake news, conspiracy theories, deepfakes, and competing narratives about reality, the idea that there's something that resists symbolization, that can't be captured in any narrative, seems increasingly crucial. Climate change is a perfect example. The scientific data is clear, but somehow this real keeps being denied, explained away, deferred. Why? Because accepting it would require transforming our entire economic system, our way of life, our fundamental relationship to nature. It's too traumatic, too disruptive, so we construct fantasies. It's not really happening, it's part of natural cycles, technology will save us, to avoid confronting the real. The pandemic was another case. The reality of viral spread, of bodies overwhelmed by infection, of death on a massive scale, this real kept intruding into social fantasies. Conspiracy theories proliferated as attempts to re-narrativize the traumatic real, to give it meaning, to identify someone to blame. Lacan's point is that the real never goes away. You can deny it, cover it with fantasies, try to symbolize it, but it returns. It erupts as symptom, as trauma, as the gaps and contradictions in our narratives. Learning to acknowledge the real, to accept its irreducible presence, becomes an ethical imperative. This doesn't mean we can know the real directly or represent it accurately. The real, by definition, exceeds our capacity for representation. But we can recognize its effects, the way it makes itself felt through failures and breakdowns. We can remain open to disruption, to having our certainties challenged, to encountering what doesn't fit our categories.
A living theoretical practice. What makes Lacan's legacy vital, rather than merely historical, is that it remains a living practice. There are analysts worldwide working clinically with Lacanian concepts, adapting them to new contexts and new problems. There are scholars developing the theory, arguing over interpretations, extending concepts in new directions. This isn't just academic preservation of a dead thinker's work. It's active engagement with ideas that continue to generate insight and transformation. Each analand's encounter with their unconscious is unique. Each cultural formation presents new phenomena to analyze. The theory develops through this ongoing encounter with particularity. Perhaps this is Lacan's deepest legacy. Not a finished system, but a method, a style of thinking, a way of remaining open to the unconscious dimension of experience. He taught us to read symptomatically, to look for what's not being said, to attend to gaps and contradictions and repetitions. He showed us that the most obvious common sense interpretations are usually defensive fantasies. This style of thinking is valuable regardless of whether you accept all of Lacan's specific theoretical claims. It's a form of critical awareness that sees beyond surface appearances, that questions naturalizations, that remains suspicious of any claim to complete knowledge or final solutions.